The classroom was eerily quiet, with only the soft hum of the ceiling fan breaking the stillness. Mrs. Wilkins stood at the front of the room, her sharp gaze sweeping over her students, trying to maintain her usual calm composure. It was an ordinary Tuesday at Westbrook High, the kind of day that felt predictable and routine. Yet something in the air told her that today wouldn't be just another regular class. Before we dive into today's story, where are you watching from? Drop a comment below and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss an exciting update. Her eyes lingered on one student in particular. Harrison Keeney. He sat at his usual spot, the last desk in the back row, staring out the window with a distant, vacant expression. He was the quietest in the class, his face often hidden behind his books or the unkempt hair that fell over his eyes. He wasn't the sort to raise his hand or get involved in group discussions. Instead, he preferred to observe, retreating into his own little world. And in Mrs. Wilkins' eyes, that made him an enigma. For months now, she had watched Harrison closely. His silence made her uneasy. While other students chatted, laughed, and even struggled to focus, Harrison was always aloof, as if he didn't belong. There were days when he barely even registered her instructions. His notes were always neat, his work spotless, but there was a strange detachment about him, a coldness that unsettled Mrs. Wilkins more than she cared to admit. Today, as she gave her usual lecture on the principles of geometry, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Harrison had barely looked up during the entire class. When Mrs. Wilkins called on him for an answer, there was no response. His mind was elsewhere. And though she tried not to let it affect her, a strange sense of frustration bubbled inside her. Why was he always so disengaged? What was it about him that seemed to break the rhythm of the class? The other students never noticed. They were too caught up in their own dramas. But Mrs. Wilkins couldn't ignore it. She needed to know what was going on with him. The bell rang, signaling the end of the lesson. The students started gathering their belongings, eager to leave the confines of the classroom and head to their next classes. But before anyone could make a move, Mrs. Wilkins spoke sharply. "Harrison," she called, her voice cutting through the chatter. "I need to speak with you." Harrison froze, his fingers hovering over the edge of his notebook. A wave of anxiety washed over him, but he quickly masked it with his usual, composed demeanor. He gathered his things slowly and made his way to the front of the room, feeling the weight of Mrs. Wilkins' stare burning into him. When he reached her desk, she didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Harrison," she said, her voice firm but lacking any warmth, "I've had enough. Your behavior in class is unacceptable. You've been a disruption for weeks now." Harrison's heart skipped a beat. Disruption? He hadn't spoken a word the entire class. He hadn't even moved. What could she possibly mean? "I don't know what your problem is," Mrs. Wilkins continued, her tone growing colder, "but I'm suspending you for the next few days. This kind of behavior cannot continue." Harrison's mind raced, his chest tightening with confusion and disbelief. He tried to speak, but his voice faltered. "I didn't do anything wrong," he stammered, his usual calm now slipping away. Mrs. Wilkins didn't flinch. "I've been watching you," she said, her eyes narrowing. "You've been distracted, absent even when you're here. You think you can just slide under the radar, but I'm not letting you off the hook this time." Harrison felt a wave of humiliation rise in his chest. He couldn't understand why this was happening. He wasn't the problem. He wasn't the one causing any trouble. But Mrs. Wilkins' mind was made up. He was the quiet student, the one who didn't fit in, and in her eyes that was enough. As he left the room, his thoughts were clouded. What was happening? Why was Mrs. Wilkins so adamant about punishing him for something he hadn't even done? Little did she know, the boy she had just suspended was more than just a quiet student. Harrison Keeney was someone with a story that could change everything, and soon the truth would come to light, in a way no one, least of all Mrs. Wilkins, could have ever expected. The next few days felt like a blur for Harrison. His suspension had left him with an overwhelming sense of confusion, frustration, and helplessness. He spent the first few hours of that afternoon wandering aimlessly through the streets, trying to clear his mind. The sudden dismissal felt like an unfair blow, and it had shaken him deeply. He had always been a quiet student, Yes, but that didn't mean he deserved this kind of treatment. He wasn't the one causing problems. He never was. It wasn't as though he was some troublemaker who went looking for a fight. Harrison didn't speak much in class, but that was because he had always preferred to observe. His mind was often lost in thoughts about something greater, something that seemed out of reach from the small confines of the classroom. But now, after Mrs. Wilkins' decision, he began to feel like the very thing he tried to hide, his difference, was the reason he was being punished. The day after his suspension began, he tried to avoid contact with anyone. His phone lay on the desk, buzzing with messages from his classmates. They were curious about why he had been suspended, but Harrison wasn't ready to answer. The truth was, no one truly knew who he was, at least not the real Harrison. As his thoughts swirled, his phone buzzed again, this time with a message that caught his attention. It was from his father. "The principal is requesting to speak with you tomorrow. Be sure to be present." His father's message was brief, but it was enough to make Harrison's heart sink. His father was always professional, always calm and composed. But Harrison knew his father was also a man of great power, someone whose influence reached far beyond the small high school he attended. The thought of his father getting involved in this situation made Harrison's stomach churn. The next day, Harrison walked into the principal's office, the weight of the world bearing down on him. The room was cold, sterile, filled with shelves of awards and academic accolades. Mrs. Wilkins was seated at a chair by the door, arms crossed and a rigid expression on her face. But it wasn't her that caught Harrison's attention. It was the man standing next to her, a man in a dark suit with an aura of authority that could not be ignored. Harrison didn't need to be told who he was. Dr. Harold Kinney, his father. "Sit down, son." Dr. Kinney's voice was calm, controlled, but Harrison could hear the unspoken tension in his tone. His father had always been a man of few words, but when he spoke, people listened. Harrison did as instructed, his body stiffening as he sat across from his father. "Your teacher has informed me about the situation, Harrison," Dr. Kinney began, his gaze flickering between his son and Mrs. Wilkins. "She believes you've been disruptive, and I believe there has been a misunderstanding. But we need to clear things up, don't we?" Harrison nodded, but before he could respond, Mrs. Wilkins spoke up. "I'm not sure there's anything to clear up. His behavior has been an issue for a while now. The fact that he refuses to participate in class, his distant behavior, it's a disruption to the whole environment." Harrison's breath caught in his throat. Distant behavior? He had never thought of himself as a disruption. He had always kept to himself, never wanted to draw attention to himself. Yet here he was, being accused of something he didn't even understand. "Mrs. Wilkins, I must respectfully disagree," Dr. Kinney said, his voice ice cold. "Harrison is a well-behaved student, and as his teacher, I'm sure you are aware that students are not all the same. Some are more reserved than others, some require more time to process things. You've known this about him, and yet you've chosen to make him the problem." Mrs. Wilkins stiffened, and Harrison could see the tension rise in the room. She opened her mouth, ready to argue, but Dr. Kinney raised a hand to silence her. "Harrison," his father turned to him now, his eyes softening slightly. "I understand that you prefer to keep things to yourself, but I need you to understand something. Your mother and I have always tried to shield you from the world's expectations. We've always wanted you to stay true to yourself. But sometimes the world doesn't work that way." Harrison swallowed hard, unsure of what his father meant. Was this a lecture? Was his father disappointed in him? His mind spun with questions, but before he could voice any of them, Dr. Kinney continued. "It's time you understood why people view you the way they do. You're not just any ordinary student, Harrison. You're the son of a Nobel laureate, and that comes with its own set of expectations. People look at you and think you should be extraordinary, and when you're not, when you don't fit the mold, they assume there's something wrong with you." The words hit Harrison like a punch to the gut. His father was right. He had always known that people expected more from him because of who his parents were. But hearing it spoken out loud, especially from his father, stung in a way he couldn't describe. Mrs. Wilkins watched the exchange, her face a mixture of skepticism and frustration. She had no idea the weight Harrison carried. To her, he was just another student who failed to meet expectations, one whose behavior was too erratic and disruptive to go unnoticed. But she had no idea who she was dealing with. "What are you going to do about it?" Mrs. Wilkins snapped, her patience clearly wearing thin. "It's obvious that Harrison's not learning anything in my class, and frankly, I don't think he's interested in being here at all." Dr. Keeney stood up, his posture straight and imposing. "I will be taking this matter to the school board. But for now, Mrs. Wilkins, I suggest you reconsider your judgment. You've made a mistake." The tension in the room thickened as Mrs. Wilkins looked from father to son. But in the silence that followed, something strange happened. Harrison could feel it, the spark of realization that this wasn't just a normal school conflict. This was bigger than him, bigger than Mrs. Wilkins and the classroom. This was about a legacy, a name, and the kind of pressure that weighed down on him every single day. Little did Harrison know, his quiet existence was about to shatter, and the consequences would be far-reaching, not only for him but for everyone involved. The following week was the turning point in Harrison's life, and the weight of it crushed him every minute. As he walked the halls of Lakeview High, he couldn't shake the feeling that everything he'd known, everything he'd trusted, was being taken away from him. The world he'd lived in, quiet, reserved, solitary, was being flipped upside down, and the consequences were far from clear. It all started when the school board met to discuss Harrison's suspension. The meeting was scheduled for a Friday afternoon, and the hallways buzzed with whispers of what might happen. Harrison couldn't bring himself to attend. The thought of facing his classmates, the teachers who doubted him, and most of all his father's stern gaze, made his stomach churn. He decided to stay home, where at least he could pretend things were normal. Pretend he still had control. But control was something Harrison had lost the moment he stepped into that principal's office. The day before the meeting, his father had dropped an unsettling bombshell. "Harrison," Dr. Keeney had said over dinner, his voice unusually gentle, "I've made arrangements with the board. You'll be reinstated, but you'll have to undergo some changes. They've suggested counseling, a mentor, and you'll have to be more involved in school activities. That's the price." Harrison barely reacted, his mind still clouded by the earlier conversation. The idea of being under even more scrutiny, of changing himself to fit the world's expectations, was the last thing he wanted. But his father's influence was too powerful, and Harrison knew better than to argue. There was no winning against him. Harrison could feel the weight of his father's career, his reputation, bearing down on him. It wasn't just about school anymore. It was about their family name, about the legacy. That Friday, while the meeting was taking place, Harrison stood in his room, staring out of the window. The sunlight streamed through the blinds, casting a warm glow across his desk, but it felt hollow. For the first time, Harrison realized how little of his life was truly his own. His thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. "Dad?" Harrison's voice trembled as he opened it to find his father standing there, looking as composed as ever. But Harrison could see something in his father's eyes, a quiet disappointment, a sense of urgency. "They want you at the meeting," Dr. Keeney said, his tone authoritative, but there was a flicker of something else in his voice, something that made Harrison's chest tighten. "It's time for you to take responsibility, son." Harrison's heart pounded in his ears. He didn't want to go. He didn't want to face the people who had already made up their minds about him, who had judged him before hearing his side. But his father's words echoed in his mind, and with a sense of dread, Harrison followed him to the meeting. As they entered the conference room, the tension was palpable. The school board sat at one end of the long table, their expressions stern and unreadable. Mrs. Wilkins was there, her arms crossed in front of her, and Harrison could feel her eyes drilling into him as he took a seat. The silence in the room was heavy, like everyone was waiting for something to break. Dr. Keeney cleared his throat and spoke first, as usual, his voice steady and firm. "Gentlemen, ladies, I'm here to address the concerns regarding my son Harrison. We believe the suspension was a result of misunderstanding. He has been a quiet student, but that does not equate to disruption. I trust this matter can be resolved swiftly." Mrs. Wilkins spoke next, her tone sharp. "With all due respect, Dr. Keeney, we have been more than patient. Harrison's behavior has been a problem for months now. He's isolated himself from the rest of the class. He's withdrawn, uninterested, and that creates an environment that's difficult to manage. The suspension was a necessary step. Harrison could feel the weight of the room's eyes on him. He wanted to speak, to explain himself, but the words wouldn't come. He felt like a child again, helpless and trapped in his father's shadow. He opened his mouth, but before he could utter a single word, Dr. Keeney intervened. "Harrison is not a failure, Mrs. Wilkins," his father said, his voice carrying a quiet but firm authority. "He's not broken. He just needs understanding." At those words, something inside Harrison snapped. For the first time, he stood up and spoke without thinking. "I'm not broken, Dad. I don't need fixing." His voice cracked, but he continued, feeling the anger bubbling to the surface. "I don't need to be like everyone else. I don't need to be the perfect student. I'm not like you, and I'm not like her." He shot a glance at Mrs. Wilkins. "And I don't want to be. I just want to be left alone." The room fell into stunned silence. Dr. Keeney looked taken aback, his face hardening. Mrs. Wilkins's expression didn't change, but the disapproval in her eyes was sharp. For a moment, Harrison felt like the walls were closing in, like his words had sealed his fate. But then something shifted. Harrison's voice, though shaky, had spoken a truth he'd kept hidden for so long, and for the first time, his father didn't try to shut him down. There was no reprimanding, no immediate correction. Instead, Dr. Keeney looked at him, and for the first time in a long while, Harrison saw something close to understanding in his father's eyes. "We'll figure this out," Dr. Keeney said, his voice softer than before. "We'll find a way for you to be yourself, Harrison. But you need to understand, the world won't always be kind to people who don't conform. We'll find a balance." It wasn't a resolution, not entirely. But in that moment, Harrison realized that maybe there was more to this situation than he had first believed. It wasn't just about the school board. It wasn't just about his father's expectations or Mrs. Wilkins's judgment. It was about him, finding a way to exist in a world that didn't understand him, a world that seemed to demand conformity, even if it meant losing yourself. For the first time, Harrison felt like he might have a chance to carve out a space where he could be both himself and part of something bigger. A space where he didn't have to choose between the two. In the weeks that followed, things at Lakeview High slowly began to change, but not in the way Harrison had expected. The meeting with the school board, while tense, had been the catalyst for something that Harrison couldn't have predicted. The beginning of his transformation. Not into someone else, but into a version of himself that he could finally accept without fear of judgment or expectation. But it was a rocky road. At first, Harrison felt like an outsider, even more than before. Though he had reluctantly agreed to the counseling sessions, which were now mandatory as part of his reinstatement, he resented the idea of being fixed. Every session felt like another step deeper into a world he didn't belong to. The counselor, Mr. Green, was kind, but Harrison couldn't shake the feeling that everything he said was filtered through a lens of pity. It made him uncomfortable. Still, he continued to attend, mostly to appease his father. But something happened during one of those sessions that shifted his perspective. Mr. Green, sensing Harrison's resistance, decided to take a different approach. Instead of discussing grades or his social life, the counselor asked him about his love for cooking, a hobby Harrison had kept hidden for so long. "You like to cook, don't you, Harrison?" Mr. Green had asked one afternoon, his voice calm and steady. Harrison had been caught off guard. He'd never talked about it to anyone, not even his father. Cooking had always been his escape, his way of creating something real when everything else in his life felt out of his control. "Yeah," Harrison mumbled, his gaze dropping to his shoes. "I like making things. It's just easier than everything else. It makes sense." Mr. Green nodded thoughtfully. "Have you ever thought about why it feels like that? Why does cooking bring you peace?" Harrison didn't have an immediate answer, but the question lingered in his mind. He spent the next few days thinking about it, about how the act of chopping vegetables, the rhythm of stirring a pot, the smell of fresh herbs grounded him. Cooking had always been his refuge from the noise of the world. For the first time, he began to understand why. The more he reflected on it, the more he realized that cooking wasn't just a hobby. It was a way for him to express himself. It was his language. The kitchen was his world, and in it, he didn't have to conform to anyone's standards. No one judged him for his technique or questioned his choices. When he cooked, he was free. With this new understanding, Harrison began to embrace his passions more openly. He started bringing his culinary creations to school, sharing them with classmates who, to his surprise, were genuinely interested. It was during a class project, when he had to prepare a dish for a fundraiser, that Harrison's world began to shift in the most unexpected way. He had prepared his signature dish, a comforting, hearty chicken stew that reminded him of the long hours his mother had spent in the kitchen when she was still around. The dish was simple but rich in flavor, and when Harrison shared it with his classmates, they loved it. One of his classmates, Maria, a quiet girl with a passion for art, was especially taken with his cooking. "Wow, Harrison," Maria said, her eyes wide with appreciation. "You should really consider doing something with this. It's amazing." For the first time in a long while, Harrison felt seen. Not for his grades, not for his behavior, but for something that was uniquely him. He didn't have to hide behind his silence anymore. Cooking had become his bridge to connecting with others, and the response from his peers gave him the confidence to keep going. But there were still moments when he felt out of place. His relationship with his father had become strained, as Dr. Keeney continued to pressure him to pursue a more academic path. The conversations at home were often tense, with Harrison's father insisting that he needed to focus on his studies and his future career. Harrison's resistance grew stronger, but the conflict was different now. He wasn't just angry for the sake of being angry. He had a sense of purpose, something he had lacked for years. It was during one of these tense dinners that Harrison finally found the courage to speak up again. His father, ever the perfectionist, was lecturing him about his distractions. "Cooking is a hobby, Harrison," Dr. Keeney said, his tone sharp. "It's not a career. You need to focus on your future." Harrison put down his fork and looked his father in the eye. "Maybe cooking can be part of my future. Maybe I don't need to follow the path you've set for me." His father's face hardened, but Harrison could see a flicker of something deeper. Uncertainty. Perhaps even fear. It was the first time Harrison had stood up to his father in this way, and though his heart raced, he felt empowered. His voice was steady as he continued, "I don't want to be what you want me to be. I want to find my own way." The silence that followed was thick, suffocating even. But then, to Harrison's surprise, Dr. Keeney nodded slowly, as if for the first time considering his son's words without judgment. "Then we'll find a way for you to do that," Dr. Keeney said quietly. "But you'll have to work hard. Nothing worth having comes easy." Harrison felt a weight lift from his shoulders. It wasn't an agreement, not completely, but it was progress. For the first time, it seemed like his father might be willing to support him, even if it meant letting him go down a different path. The next few months were still challenging, but Harrison knew he was on a new journey. One that was his own. The support of his peers, the validation of his passion for cooking, and his growing confidence made all the difference. By the time graduation approached, Harrison had a clear vision for his future. He applied to culinary schools, choosing one that specialized in teaching young chefs to create unique personal dishes. And for the first time in his life, he felt like he was finally stepping into the person he was always meant to be. No longer defined by the expectations of others, but by his own dreams. As he walked across the stage to receive his high school diploma, Harrison's father was in the audience, watching proudly. Harrison wasn't sure what the future held, but one thing was clear. For the first time in years, he was ready to face it on his own terms. The journey of Harrison Keeney is a powerful reminder that personal growth and self-discovery are often found in the most unexpected places. The story teaches us that success and fulfillment don't always follow the conventional paths laid out by society. And sometimes it's essential to break free from the expectations of others to pursue what truly makes us feel alive. One of the central messages of Harrison's story is the importance of embracing one's passions, even when they don't align with the norms or standards that others may expect. Harrison's love for cooking, something he had kept hidden for so long, became the key to his transformation. It was through this hobby that he found a sense of purpose, a form of self-expression, and a means to connect with others. This teaches us that sometimes our true calling doesn't lie in what we're told to pursue, but in what ignites our inner spark, our unique passion. Another critical lesson from Harrison's journey is the significance of standing up for oneself, even when it means going against the grain. Throughout his story, Harrison struggles with the pressure of conforming to the expectations set by his father and society. His initial resistance is rooted in the belief that he must fit into a predetermined mold, yet it is only when he finds the courage to voice his true desires that he begins to take control of his future. Harrison's bold decision to stand up to his father and assert his own path is a powerful reminder that the strength to live authentically comes from within. And sometimes we have to challenge those who try to shape our lives according to their own vision. The story also speaks to the importance of resilience in the face of adversity. Despite the pressures he faced, from academic expectations to the weight of his father's ambitions, Harrison did not give up. He faced each challenge head-on and allowed each setback to be a stepping stone toward his ultimate goal. The lesson here is that life's obstacles are not roadblocks, but opportunities for growth. Resilience is the ability to adapt, learn from setbacks, and keep moving forward, no matter how difficult the journey may seem. Finally, Harrison's relationship with his father offers a poignant lesson about the evolving nature of love and understanding. While his father initially fails to see Harrison for who he truly is, their relationship gradually shifts as both father and son begin to understand each other better. The story suggests that growth, both personal and relational, is possible when we approach each other with an open heart and a willingness to listen. The change in Dr. Keeney, from being a rigid figure of authority to someone who is willing to support Harrison's dreams, illustrates the power of compromise and mutual respect in healing strained relationships. Ultimately, Harrison's story teaches us that authenticity, resilience, and the courage to follow our own path are essential for a fulfilling life. When we embrace who we truly are and pursue what we love, we not only find happiness but also discover the strength to overcome any challenge life throws our way. The message is clear. Follow your passions, stand up for yourself, and never be afraid to rewrite your story.